The morning briefing at Forward Operating Base Sentinel began at 0530 hours, but Rachel Martinez had been awake since 0300. She stood near the communications tent, watching the Afghan mountains turn gold under the rising sun, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold 30 minutes ago. 23. Rachel was an anomaly at the base. Born in Phoenix, Arizona, she had enlisted straight out of high school with dreams of serving her country. Her emotional responses to the harsh realities of war had earned her a reputation she couldn't shake. The other soldiers called her Tears. Behind her back, not with cruelty, but with the kind of dismissive affection reserved for someone they considered too sensitive for real combat. Rachel stood barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighed 125 pounds. But what really set her apart wasn't her size. It was her tendency to wear her heart on her sleeve. When civilian casualties were reported, her eyes would well up. When fellow soldiers were injured, she'd openly show concern in ways that made the hardened veterans uncomfortable. In a culture that prized emotional control above all else, Rachel's authentic reactions marked her as someone who couldn't handle the pressure when it really mattered. The irony was that she was one of the most technically proficient soldiers on the base. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5%. Her knowledge of artillery coordination was encyclopedic. She could calculate firing solutions in her head faster than most soldiers could with computers. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had an intuitive understanding of Afghan terrain that came from months of studying local geography and culture. But none of that seemed to matter when mission assignments were handed out. The briefing tent buzzed with pre-dawn energy as she slipped inside. Maps covered every surface, red zones marking Taliban strongholds, blue lines indicating patrol routes. Major Derek Harrison stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled teams. Rachel found her usual spot near the communications equipment, her notebook ready, though she already suspected what role she'd be assigned. Today's reconnaissance mission is codenamed Desert Wind, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in special operations. We've got intelligence indicating high-value targets in Sector 12. This is a joint operation with SEAL Team 7. I need absolute precision and complete situational awareness. Rachel's pen hovered over her notepad as Harrison began reading. Assignments. Rodriguez, your lead reconnaissance. Thompson, you're handling Overwatch. Williams, you're on point communications. The names continued, each one representing months of training together, shared experiences under fire, proven competence in combat situations. But when it came to Rachel, Harrison's tone shifted slightly. Martinez, you're managing base communications. Coordination. Monitor all radio traffic and maintain situation reports for command. Base communications. Again, Rachel nodded professionally, her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of disappointment. Around her, the selected team members exchanged confident grins and tactical discussions. She might as well have been invisible dot. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten. Honestly, I'm glad Martinez isn't coming with us, she heard Sergeant Jackson whisper to his partner. Last thing we need in a firefight is someone breaking down when things get intense. She's solid with the technical stuff, Rodriguez replied. But combat's different. When bullets start flying, you need people who can compartmentalize. She feels everything too much. Rachel pretended to organize her notes, but the words cut deep. She'd heard variations of this assessment countless times. Too emotional, too reactive, too likely to crack under real pressure. It didn't matter that she'd never actually failed in a crisis situation. The assumption was that her emotional responses would eventually become a liability. The most frustrating part was that she understood their reasoning, even if she disagreed with it. In life or death situations, Emotional control was crucial. But what they failed to understand was that her emotional investment wasn't a weakness. It was what drove her to be better prepared, more knowledgeable, more committed to bringing everyone home safely. That afternoon, while the reconnaissance team prepared for their mission, Rachel threw herself into studying Sector 12. She memorized every elevation marker, every potential cover position, every historical pattern of Taliban movement in the area. She updated her knowledge of artillery positions and reviewed communication protocols until she could execute them in her sleep. Nobody had asked her to do this additional preparation. Nobody expected it. But Rachel had learned that being ready for opportunity or crisis was the only way to prove that emotional investment could be a strength rather than a weakness. The team departed at 1400 hours, their vehicles disappearing into the shimmering heat of the Afghan desert. Rachel watched from the communication center until they were just dust clouds on the horizon, then settled in for what she expected would be a routine day of monitoring radio chatter and filing reports. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, everything would change. That the quiet afternoon would transform into the most intense combat situation of her military career. That her emotional investment, her obsessive preparation, and her refusal to accept limitations would become the difference between life and death for two Navy SEALs, whose names she didn't even know yet. The first indication of trouble came at 1537 hours, crackling through the radio in the form of urgent, clipped voices that made Rachel's blood run cold. Rachel was updating communication logs when Rodriguez's voice cut through the static, tight with controlled panic. Base, this is Desert Wind Alpha. We are taking heavy fire. Repeat, we are under attack in Sector 12 Alpha. Rachel dropped her pen and leaned into the radio console, her hands automatically moving to adjust frequencies and boost signal strength. Around the communication center, other personnel stopped their activities and turned toward the speakers. Desert Wind, this is Base. What's your situation? Major Harrison's voice responded from the command center next door. Multiple hostiles, estimated 15 to 20 Taliban fighters. They were waiting for us, sir. Sir, this was an ambush. Rodriguez's voice was punctuated by the distinctive crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of RPG explosions. We've got 2 men down, 1 critical. Requesting immediate extraction and close air support. Rachel's hands moved across the communication board without conscious thought, switching to encrypted channels and establishing backup communication links. Her emotional response to crisis, the same trait that made others doubt her combat readiness, now translated into hypervigilant focus. Every sound, every pause in transmission, every change in vocal tone registered in her consciousness. Desert Wind, extraction team is 20 minutes out. Can you hold position? Harrison asked. There was a pause filled with gunfire before Rodriguez responded. Negative, sir. Position is compromised. We're moving to secondary extraction point, but we've got wounded who can't move fast. We need artillery support to clear our 6. Rachel was already calculating firing solutions before anyone asked. She'd memorized the terrain of Sector 12, knew exactly where the secondary extraction point was located, and could visualize the likely Taliban positions based on the sound patterns coming through the radio. Her fingers flew across the communication console, pulling up artillery coordination channels. Rodriguez, she said into her headset, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This is base communications. What's your exact grid reference? Who is this? Rodriguez's voice came back, confused by the unfamiliar protocol. This is Martinez. I need your precise location for artillery coordination. What's your grid reference? There was another pause filled with the sound of sustained gunfire. Then Rodriguez's voice returned, professional despite the circumstances. Grid reference 4-1-Romeo-Quebec- Quebec-1-2-3-4-6-7-8-9-90. But Martinez, you're not certified for artillery coordination. I've got it, Rachel interrupted, her hands already inputting coordinates into the fire direction system. She could hear Major Harrison in the background, probably trying to locate the official artillery coordinator, but there wasn't time for proper protocol. The next transmission from Rodriguez made everyone in the communication center freeze. Base, we've got a bigger problem. SEAL Team 7 is also in Sector 12, and they're not responding to radio calls. Last known position was Grid 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-5-6-7-8-9-1-2-3. Rachel felt ice form in her stomach. The SEALs were operating independently, but they were less than 2 miles from the ambush site. If they'd been compromised, there were now potentially 4 special operations soldiers in immediate danger. Desert wind, maintain your movement to secondary extraction. I'm trying to raise SEAL Team 7, Harrison ordered. For the next 10 minutes, Rachel listened to increasingly desperate attempts to contact the SEALs while simultaneously coordinating artillery support for Rodriguez's team. She could hear the stress building in Rodriguez's voice as his team moved through hostile territory with wounded soldiers. And she could sense Harrison's growing concern about the missing SEALs. Then, at 15:52 hours, a transmission came through that changed everything. Any station. This is SEAL Team 7. We are down to 2 effectives with multiple wounded. Request immediate assistance. Grid reference 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-4-5-6-7-8-9-1-2. The voice was weak, barely audible through static and background noise. Rachel quickly triangulated the position. The SEALs were pinned down in a ravine approximately 3 miles from the nearest friendly forces, with no clear extraction route. SEAL Team 7, this is base, Harrison responded immediately. What's your status? 2 Kia, 2 critical wounded, 2 walking wounded, came the reply. We're surrounded and taking heavy fire from elevated positions. We can't move the critical casualties without assistance. Rachel stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. The extraction team was already committed to Rodriguez's position. The helicopter support was 20 minutes away, but the SEALs might not have 20 minutes. Artillery couldn't fire danger close to their position without risking friendly fire casualties. Someone needed to reach the SEALs physically, provide immediate medical assistance, and help coordinate their extraction. Someone who could navigate the terrain, fight their way through hostile territory, and maintain communication with both the SEALs and Base Command. As these thoughts crystallized in her mind, Rachel realized that everyone in the communication center was looking at her. They'd all reached the same conclusion, but none of them wanted to voice it. The SEALs needed help that only she was positioned to provide, but getting to them would mean leaving her assigned post, disobeying orders, and putting herself in the most dangerous combat situation the base had faced in months. Rachel looked at the radio console, then at the tactical map showing 2 separate teams of American soldiers fighting for their lives in the Afghan desert. Her emotional investment in their survival, the same trait that made others question her combat readiness, now crystallized into absolute clarity. She stood up and began gathering her gear. Martinez, what are you doing? Sergeant Williams asked, as Rachel began strapping on her tactical vest and checking her weapon systems. I'm going to get them, she replied simply, her voice carrying a calm determination that surprised everyone in the room. You can't just leave your post, Williams protested. You're not authorized for field operations, and Major Harrison specifically assigned you to communications coordination. Rachel paused in her preparations and looked directly at Williams. Sergeant, Those SEALs have maybe 15 minutes before they're overrun. The extraction team is committed elsewhere. Air support is 20 minutes out, and artillery can't fire. Danger close without killing them. Someone has to reach them now. That someone isn't you, Williams shot back. You're communications, not infantry. You've never been in actual combat. The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. Rachel had trained extensively, had proven herself in every simulation and exercise, but she'd never faced live enemy fire. Her emotional responses had always kept her away from the sharp end of military operations. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the pinned-down SEALs, those same emotions that others saw as weakness crystallized into unshakable resolve. I know the terrain better than anyone else on this base, she said, shouldering her pack. I've memorized every route, every elevation, every piece of cover between here and their position. I can navigate there in 30 minutes. Martinez, this is insane, another communications specialist interjected. Even if you could reach them, what then? You can't carry 2 wounded SEALs by yourself. Rachel finished her equipment check and turned toward the exit. Then I guess I'll figure it out when I get there. As she reached the door, Williams called out one more time. What do I tell Major Harrison when he asks where you've gone? Rachel paused without turning around. Tell him I went to bring our people home. The route to the SEAL's position took her through terrain that looked deceptively peaceful under the afternoon sun. Rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation, scattered rock outcroppings that provided natural cover, and the occasional dried riverbed that carved serpentine paths through the landscape. It was the kind of scenery that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but Rachel knew that beauty was deceptive. Every hill could hide enemy fighters. Every rock formation could conceal an ambush. And every step took her deeper into territory where Taliban forces had been operating for years. She moved carefully but quickly, using the navigation skills she developed through months of studying the local geography. Her emotional investment in understanding this environment, previously dismissed as excessive preparation, now guided her through the safest routes toward the embattled SEALs. 20 minutes into her movement, she heard the first sounds of combat ahead. The distinctive crack of M4 carbines mixed with the heavier reports of AK-47s and the occasional boom of RPG explosions. The SEALs were still fighting, which meant they were still alive. Rachel keyed her radio, keeping her voice low. SEAL Team 7. This is base communications. I'm approximately 1 click from your position, approaching from the southeast. What's your tactical situation? The response came immediately, tight with pain and exhaustion. Base communications, this is Chief Petty Officer Marcus Davis. We're in a ravine with steep walls on 3 sides. Enemy has high ground advantage. And we're running low on ammunition. 2 of my men need immediate medical attention. Copy that, Chief? I'm carrying medical supplies and can provide artillery coordination. Hold your position. I'm coming to you. There was a pause before Davis's voice returned, confusion evident despite the combat stress. Base communications. Did you say you're approaching our position? Are you part of the extraction team? Rachel smiled grimly as she navigated around. A cluster of rocks that would have been invisible on satellite imagery, but were clearly marked in her mental map of the terrain. Negative, Chief. I'm just someone who refuses to let good people die on a sunny day. The last 500 meters to the SEAL's position proved to be the most challenging. The terrain became increasingly broken, with steep slopes and narrow passages that channeled movement into predictable routes. Rachel could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing, punctuated by shouts in Pashto that indicated the Taliban fighters were coordinating their assault. She crested a small ridge and saw the tactical situation spread out below her like a deadly diorama. The SEALs were positioned in a narrow ravine, using scattered rocks and a destroyed vehicle for cover. On the surrounding high ground, muzzle flashes marked the positions of at least 12 enemy fighters who had the Americans completely surrounded. 2 of the SEALs were clearly wounded, lying motionless behind cover while their teammates returned fire with decreasing frequency, a sure sign of ammunition running low. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional rescue would require overwhelming force that wasn't available. But Rachel hadn't come this far to attempt a conventional rescue. As she studied the enemy positions and calculated firing solutions for artillery support, she realized that her emotional investment in saving these men had led her to a moment that would define not just her military career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. She keyed her radio one more time. "Chief Davis, this is your backup. I'm in position to provide fire support and medical assistance. Get ready to move your wounded. We're going home today." Rachel positioned herself on the ridge overlooking the ravine, her heart pounding as she assessed the tactical situation. Below her, she could see Chief Petty Officer Davis and what appeared to be 5 other SEALs pinned down behind inadequate cover. 2 were clearly unconscious or worse, their bodies motionless despite the chaos around them. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush position well. They controlled the high ground on 3 sides of the ravine, creating a killing field that made any movement by the SEALs extremely dangerous. Their firing positions were well concealed among the rocks, making individual targets difficult to identify. But Rachel's months of studying local terrain had taught her something the Taliban fighters probably didn't know. This particular ravine had been carved by seasonal flooding, which meant there was a drainage channel that ran along its eastern edge. The channel was invisible from most angles, but it could provide concealed movement for someone who knew where to look. She keyed her radio to the artillery coordination frequency. "Fire Direction Center. This is Forward Observer Martinez. I need immediate fire mission. Grid reference 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-4-5-6-7-8-9-0-1-2. Martinez, this is FDC, came the surprised response. "You're not certified as a forward observer, and we show you as assigned to base communications. FDC, I have eyes on 12 to 15 enemy fighters engaging friendly forces. I need high explosive rounds, proximity fused, targeting the northern ridgeline. Danger close friendlies are 300 meters south of target area." There was a pause before the artillery coordinator responded. "Martinez, danger close artillery requires authorization from a qualified forward observer or field commander. We cannot process this request." Rachel felt frustration building as she watched the SEAL situation deteriorate. Bureaucracy was going to get good men killed while she had the knowledge and position to help them. "FDC, this is Chief Petty Officer Davis," came a new voice on the radio. "I'm authorizing Martinez as our forward observer. We need that fire mission now." "Roger, Chief. Martinez, send your fire mission." Rachel smiled grimly as she began calling in coordinates. Her obsessive study of artillery procedures, dismissed as irrelevant to her communications role, now became the key to saving lives. Fire mission. Grid 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-4-6-0-8-9-1-5-0. Enemy personnel in the open. High explosive. Proximity fused. 3 rounds. Fire for effect. "Shot out," came the response from the Fire Direction Center. "Shot out," Rachel acknowledged, then keyed her radio to the SEALs. "Chief Davis, artillery. Rounds inbound. 30 seconds. When they impact, I'm moving to your position via the drainage channel on your eastern flank." "Negative. Base communications," Davis replied immediately. "That approach is covered by enemy fire. You'll be walking into a kill zone." "Chief, trust me on this one. I've studied this terrain for months." There's a concealed approach that the enemy can't observe from their current positions. The artillery rounds impacted with thunderous explosions. That shook the ground and sent clouds of dust and debris into the air. Rachel could see the muzzle flashes from the northern position cease momentarily as the Taliban fighters took cover from the bombardment. She used that moment of confusion to begin her descent into the ravine, following the drainage channel she'd identified on topographical maps but had never actually seen. The route was treacherous. Loose rocks threatened to send her tumbling into the open, and thorny vegetation tore at her uniform, but it provided the concealment she needed. Halfway down the slope, she heard the crack of rifle fire and felt something tug at her sleeve. The Taliban fighters had spotted her movement and were trying to acquire her as a target. She low-crawled the remaining distance, using every piece of cover available, when she finally dropped into the ravine beside the SEAL's position. "Chief." Davis stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "I'll be damned. You actually made it." "Chief, what's the status of your wounded?" Rachel asked immediately, shifting into medic mode as she assessed the two motionless SEALs. Petty Officer Rodriguez took an AK round to the chest, but his body armor absorbed most of the impact. He's unconscious but breathing. Petty Officer Thompson caught shrapnel from an RPG in his leg and abdomen. He's critical and needs immediate evacuation. Rachel moved to Thompson first, her medical training taking over as she assessed his injuries. The shrapnel wounds were serious but manageable with proper first aid. The real problem was that both wounded men were dead weight, and the ravines. Steep walls made carrying them nearly impossible under fire. "Chief, I need to call in more artillery to suppress the enemy positions. Then we're going to move these men out of here," she said, applying pressure bandages to Thompson's wounds. "Move them where?" Davis asked. "We're completely surrounded. An extraction is still 15 minutes out." Rachel pointed toward the drainage channel she'd used to reach them. "That route leads to a natural defensive position about 500 meters south of here. Better cover, clear fields of fire, and accessible to helicopter extraction." Davis shook his head. "Even if that route is concealed, we can't carry two critical casualties up that slope under fire." "We're not going up," Rachel replied, finishing her work on Thompson's bandages. "We're going through." The sustained artillery bombardment created a wall of explosions along the ridgelines, forcing the Taliban fighters to seek deeper cover and temporarily suppressing their ability to maintain accurate fire on the ravine. Rachel used the brief respite to complete her medical assessment of both wounded SEALs. Thompson was stable, but would need surgical intervention within the next few hours. Rodriguez was regaining consciousness, his body armor having saved his life, but he was still disoriented and unable to walk without assistance. Both men would have to be carried, and the route Rachel had planned would challenge every member of the team. "Chief, I need you and your men to lay down covering fire toward the northern positions while I move Thompson," she told Davis, shouldering her rifle and preparing to lift the wounded SEAL. "You can't carry him alone," Davis protested. "Thompson weighs 180 plus gear. That's more than you weigh." Rachel looked at the unconscious SEAL, then at Davis. "Chief, I didn't come this far to leave anyone behind. Trust me." She had trained for this scenario, though no one at the base knew it. During her off-duty hours, she practiced carrying heavy loads over difficult terrain, pushing her body beyond what anyone thought possible for someone her size. Her emotional investment in being prepared for any situation had driven her to develop physical capabilities that exceeded official expectations, using a fireman's carry technique she perfected during countless training sessions. Rachel lifted Thompson onto her shoulders. The weight was enormous, but her technique distributed it efficiently across her frame. More importantly, her absolute determination to save his life gave her strength that pure physical training couldn't provide. Moving now, she announced, beginning the treacherous journey through the drainage channel with Thompson's unconscious form balanced across her shoulders. The route was a nightmare of loose rock, thorny vegetation, and steep gradients that threatened to send both of them tumbling into the open. Every step had to be calculated, every handhold tested before committing her full weight plus Thompson's to the precarious footing. Behind her, she could hear Davis and his remaining SEALs maintaining suppressive fire against the Taliban positions. Their M4 carbines provided the audio cover she needed to mask the sounds of her movement. The artillery strikes continued to impact around the enemy positions, creating confusion and preventing them from organizing an effective pursuit. Halfway through the movement, disaster struck. A loose rock gave way under her foot, sending her sliding sideways toward an exposed area where Taliban fighters would have a clear shot. With Thompson unconscious on her shoulders, she couldn't use her hands to arrest the fall. Instead, she used a technique she'd learned during rock climbing training, shifting her weight and using her legs to redirect the slide toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover. The maneuver worked, but the impact against the rocks sent pain shooting through her ribs and left shoulder. She bit back a cry of pain and kept moving, knowing that stopping would mean death for both of them. When she finally reached the defensive position she'd identified, Rachel carefully lowered Thompson behind a natural rock wall that provided excellent cover and clear sightlines in multiple directions. The position was everything she'd hoped for: defensible, accessible to helicopter extraction, and with multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated further. "Chief Davis, I'm in position with Thompson," she radioed. "The defensive position is secure. Bring Rodriguez and your team when you're ready." "Outstanding work, Martinez," Davis replied. "We're beginning movement now." But as Davis and his team started their own movement through the drainage channel, the Taliban fighters began to adapt to the new tactical situation. The artillery bombardment had disrupted their initial assault, but they were now repositioning to maintain pressure on the Americans. Rachel could see muzzle flashes from new positions as the enemy fighters attempted to cut off the SEALs' movement. The covering fire from Davis's team was becoming sporadic as they focused on their own movement, leaving gaps that the Taliban were quick to exploit. "FDC, this is Forward Observer Martinez," she called into her radio. "I need immediate shift fire to new target areas. Enemy is repositioning to intercept friendly movement." As she began calling in new artillery coordinates, Rachel realized that the enemy fighters had identified her position. Rounds began impacting around her defensive position, sending rock fragments flying and forcing her to keep her head down while simultaneously treating Thompson's wounds and coordinating fire support. The next few minutes would test every skill she'd developed, every moment of preparation she'd invested, and every ounce of determination she could summon. The Taliban fighters were closing in. Davis's team was exposed during their movement, and the extraction helicopter was still 10 minutes away. But Rachel had come too far to fail now. Her emotional investment in saving these men had brought her to this moment, and she was determined to see it through, regardless of the cost. She keyed her radio one more time, her voice steady despite the rounds impacting around her position. "All stations, this is Forward Observer Martinez. We're bringing everyone home today. Just hold on a little longer." The Taliban fighters had regrouped faster than Rachel anticipated. As Davis's team moved through the drainage channel with Rodriguez, enemy fire began to concentrate on their route, forcing the SEALs to take cover in positions that offered minimal protection. From her defensive position, Rachel could see the tactical situation developing into a deadly stalemate. The SEALs were pinned down in the channel, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to concentrated fire. The extraction helicopter was still 8 minutes away, but at the current rate of ammunition expenditure, Davis's team would be out of rounds long before help arrived. "Chief Davis, what's your ammunition status?" she called over the radio. "We're down to 2 magazines per man," Davis replied, his voice tight with controlled stress. "Rodriguez is conscious, but can barely walk. We need covering fire to complete the movement." Rachel assessed her options. The artillery support was effective, but couldn't provide the precise, sustained suppression needed to cover the SEAL's movement. The enemy fighters were too close to friendly forces for danger-close artillery strikes, and they were using cover that minimized the effectiveness of indirect fire. What the situation required was direct, accurate small arms fire from a position that could suppress multiple enemy locations simultaneously. Rachel looked at her own rifle, then at the terrain between her position and the Taliban fighters. She could provide the covering fire Davis needed, but it would mean exposing herself to return fire from at least 8 enemy positions. Given her size and the amount of open ground she'd have to cover, survival would depend entirely on speed, accuracy, and the element of surprise. "Chief, I'm going to provide covering fire for your movement," she announced, checking her weapon and ammunition supply. "Negative, Martinez," Davis replied immediately. "You're already in a good defensive position. Don't expose yourself unnecessarily." "Chief, with respect, those fighters have you pinned down, and you're running out of ammunition. Someone has to take the initiative." Rachel didn't wait for a response. She moved to the edge of her defensive position and began engaging the nearest Taliban fighter positions with carefully aimed single shots. Her marksmanship training, honed through hundreds of hours of practice that others had dismissed as excessive, now paid immediate dividends. Her first shot eliminated a fighter who had been directing fire at Davis's position. Her second took out a machine gunner who had been suppressing the drainage channel. Each shot was calculated, precise, designed to maximize tactical effect while conserving ammunition. The Taliban fighters quickly identified her as a threat and began concentrating their fire on her position. Rounds impacted around her, sending rock fragments flying and forcing her to constantly shift positions to avoid presenting a static target. But her covering fire had the desired effect. Davis's team was able to advance through the channel, carrying Rodriguez between them, while Rachel's accurate shooting kept the enemy fighters focused on their own survival rather than offensive. "Action, Martinez, we're moving," Davis called over the radio. "Keep that fire coming." Rachel continued to engage targets, her emotional investment in the mission translating into a level of focused intensity that surprised even her. Every shot mattered. Every target eliminated brought the SEALs closer to safety. Every second of suppression bought precious time for extraction. But the Taliban fighters were disciplined and experienced. They began coordinating their fire, forcing Rachel to take cover while simultaneously trying to maintain suppressive fire. It was a deadly mathematics problem with no perfect solution. That's when the first round found her. The AK-47 bullet struck her left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her rifle clattering across the rocks. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, and the immediate shock made her vision blur momentarily. But even as pain flooded her system, Rachel's mind remained focused on the mission. Davis's team was still 50 meters from her position, still vulnerable to enemy fire. Thompson was unconscious and depending on their medical care. The extraction helicopter was still 5 minutes away. She retrieved her rifle with her good arm and continued firing, using her right hand to maintain weapon control while her left arm hung useless at her side. The pain was incredible, but her emotional investment in saving these men overrode everything else. The second round hit her in the right thigh, nearly dropping her to the ground. The third caught her in the left side, just below her body armor. The fourth round grazed her head, sending blood streaming down her face and making her ears ring. But Rachel Martinez refused to fall. Her body was failing, but her determination remained absolute. As Davis's team finally reached her defensive position, Carrying Rodriguez between them, she continued to provide covering fire despite her wounds. "Jesus Christ, Martinez," Davis exclaimed when he saw her condition. "You've been hit multiple times." "I'm fine," Rachel replied, though blood was now pooling beneath her position. "Get Thompson ready for extraction." Helicopters 3 minutes out. She wasn't fine. She was bleeding from 4 separate wounds. Her vision was starting to tunnel from blood loss, and her left arm was completely useless. But the mission wasn't complete, and her emotional investment in bringing everyone home alive wouldn't let her quit. "Chief," Davis stared at Rachel in disbelief as blood continued to seep through her tactical vest. "Martinez, you need immediate medical attention. You're bleeding out." "Negative," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the shock beginning to set in. "Thompson and Rodriguez are priority for extraction. I can wait." She was lying, and they both knew it. The wound in her side was bleeding heavily, and her left shoulder was useless. The graze to her head had left her dizzy and disoriented, but her training had taught her to compartmentalize pain and focus on mission objectives. "The extraction LZ is 200 meters south of here," Davis said, pointing toward a relatively flat area that would accommodate a helicopter landing. "But we'll never make it carrying 2 wounded men while under fire." Rachel looked at the extraction zone, then at the wounded SEALs. Thompson was still unconscious, and Rodriguez was barely able to stand even with assistance. The Taliban fighters had repositioned again and were preparing for another assault on their defensive position. "Chief, how much ammunition do you have left?" she asked, reloading her own rifle with movements that were becoming increasingly clumsy as blood loss affected her coordination. "Maybe 60 rounds total for the whole team," Davis replied grimly. "Not enough for a sustained firefight." Rachel keyed her radio with her good hand. "FDC, this is Forward Observer Martinez. I need immediate suppression fire." Walking barrage. From Grid 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-4-6-0-8-9-2-0 to Grid 4-1-Romeo-Quebec-1-4-8-9-4. Duration 5 minutes. Continuous fire. "Martinez, that's a lot of ordnance," came the reply from Fire Direction Center. "Are you sure about those coordinates?" "FDC, I have multiple friendly wounded requiring extraction. I need that barrage to cover our movement to the LZ. Fire for effect." As the artillery began impacting a steady rhythm designed to suppress enemy movement across a wide area, Rachel struggled to her feet. The pain from her wounds was becoming overwhelming, but her emotional investment in saving these men provided strength that pure adrenaline couldn't match. "Chief, we're moving now," she announced. "I'll take Thompson. You get Rodriguez. Your men provide security." Davis looked at her incredulously. "Martinez, you can barely stand. You can't carry Thompson." 200 meters. "Watch me," Rachel replied, moving toward the unconscious SEAL. Using her functioning right arm and compensating for her wounded left side, she managed to get Thompson into a modified fireman's carry. The position put enormous strain on her wounded shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and began moving toward the extraction zone. The journey across 200 meters of broken terrain while carrying an unconscious man and bleeding from multiple wounds was the most difficult physical challenge of Rachel's life. Every step sent agony through her body, and her vision began to blur from blood loss. But her emotional connection to the mission, the same trait that had made others question her combat readiness, now provided the psychological strength to push through physical limitations that should have been insurmountable. Behind her, she could hear Davis's team moving with Rodriguez, their progress slow but steady. The artillery barrage was working, keeping the Taliban fighters suppressed and unable to mount an effective pursuit. Halfway to the extraction zone, Rachel's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, still holding Thompson, her body finally beginning to shut down from shock and blood loss. "Martinez," Davis called out, seeing her fall. "Keep moving," she replied, forcing herself back to her feet through pure determination. "Don't stop for me." The sound of helicopter rotors began to fill the air as the extraction aircraft approached the landing zone. Rachel could see the UH-60 Blackhawk in the distance, its crew chief already preparing for a hot extraction under fire. But the Taliban fighters had also heard the helicopter and were attempting to break through the artillery barrage to engage the aircraft. Muzzle flashes appeared from positions that the indirect fire hadn't been able to suppress, and Rachel could see tracer rounds beginning to arc toward the approaching helicopter. "Chief, the helicopter's taking fire," she called over the radio. "They need immediate suppression on the northern ridgeline." Davis's team was focused on moving Rodriguez and couldn't provide effective covering fire. The helicopter crew was trained for hot extractions, but sustained accurate fire could force them to abort the mission. Rachel looked at Thompson, unconscious in her arms, then at the helicopter crew risking their lives to save them. Her emotional investment in bringing everyone home alive crystallized into one final surge of determination. She carefully lowered Thompson behind a rock outcropping, then raised her rifle and began engaging the Taliban positions that were firing at the helicopter. Her marksmanship, even with a wounded shoulder and failing vision, was still accurate enough to suppress the enemy fighters. Each shot sent agony through her wounded shoulder, and each muzzle flash revealed her position to return fire. But Rachel continued shooting, providing the covering fire necessary for the helicopter to complete its approach. The Blackhawk touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, its crew chief jumping out to assist with loading the wounded. Rachel maintained covering fire until the last possible moment, then collapsed as exhaustion and blood loss finally overwhelmed her system. The crew chief reached Rachel just as she lost consciousness, her rifle still clutched in her right hand. Blood had soaked through her tactical vest and was pooling beneath her position, creating a crimson stain against the Afghan desert floor. "We've got multiple wounded," the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise to the flight medic. "This one's critical." Chief Davis appeared beside them, helping to lift Rachel toward the helicopter while his remaining SEALs provided security. She carried Thompson 200 meters with 4 gunshot wounds, he told the flight medic. "She's been coordinating artillery and providing covering fire for the last 30 minutes. The flight medic's eyes widened as he assessed Rachel's injuries. During the short sprint to the aircraft, gunshot wound to the left shoulder, another to the right thigh, a third to the left side that had barely missed vital organs, and a graze to the head that had left her scalp split and bleeding. "How is she still conscious?" the medic asked, applying pressure bandages as they loaded her into the helicopter. "She's not anymore," Davis replied grimly. "But she stayed conscious long enough to get us all out." As the Blackhawk lifted off from the landing zone, taking fire from Taliban positions that had managed to reposition despite the artillery barrage, the flight medic worked frantically to stabilize all 3 wounded soldiers. Thompson was responding well to treatment. Rodriguez was conscious and stable, but Rachel was rapidly going into shock from blood loss. "How far to the trauma center?" the medic called to the pilots. 12 minutes, came the reply. "We're pushing. Maximum speed." The medic looked at Rachel's pale face and weak pulse. 12 minutes might be too long. She'd lost a significant amount of blood, and her blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. But she was still fighting, her body refusing to quit even in unconsciousness. Chief Davis knelt beside her stretcher, holding pressure on her side wound. "Come on, Martinez," he said quietly. "You didn't carry us this far to give up now." During the flight, Davis began to piece together the full scope of what Rachel had accomplished. She'd left her assigned post without authorization, navigated 3 miles of hostile territory alone, coordinated complex artillery fire missions, provided medical treatment under fire, and carried 2 wounded SEALs to safety while absorbing 4 gunshot wounds herself. It was the kind of performance that military legends were built on, accomplished by someone who'd been dismissed as too emotional for real combat operations. "Chief," Rodriguez said weakly from his stretcher. "Who is she? I've never seen anything like what she just did." Davis looked at Rachel's unconscious form, her blood-stained uniform, and her small frame that had somehow carried men twice her size through hell. "She's the soldier they said was too soft for combat," he replied. Turns out they were wrong about everything. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Wolverine's Trauma Center 8 minutes later, where a full surgical team was waiting. As medical personnel rushed the wounded into the facility, word of Rachel's actions began to spread throughout the base. Major Harrison, who had spent the last 4 hours coordinating search and rescue operations, stood on the landing pad watching as Rachel was wheeled into surgery. His communication specialist, the woman he'd assigned to equipment, manifests because she was deemed too emotional for field operations, had just accomplished the most daring rescue mission in the base's operational history. "Sir, Sergeant." Williams approached him with a radio handset. "Colonel Andrews from Regional Command is on the line. He wants a full debrief on the rescue operation." Harrison took the handset, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "Colonel, this is Major Harrison. The rescue operation was successful. All personnel extracted safely. I understand one of your soldiers conducted an unauthorized solo rescue mission," the colonel replied. "What's the status of that individual?" Harrison looked toward the trauma center where Rachel was fighting for her life. "Sir, Specialist Martinez is currently in surgery. She sustained multiple gunshot wounds during the operation." "Martinez? I don't see a Martinez on your operational roster for today." "No, sir. She wasn't on the operational roster. She was assigned to base communications. She conducted the rescue mission without authorization." There was a long pause before the colonel responded. "Major, are you telling me that a communication specialist single-handedly rescued 2 Navy SEALs from a Taliban ambush?" "Sir, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And she did it while coordinating artillery fire and treating wounded under enemy fire." Another pause. "I'm going to need a very detailed report on this incident, Major. This kind of initiative is either going to result in a court-martial or a medal, possibly both." The surgery lasted 6 hours. Rachel's wounds, while not individually life-threatening, had combined to create massive blood loss and trauma that pushed her body to its absolute limits. The surgical team worked methodically to repair damaged tissue, remove bullet fragments, and stabilize her vital signs. Chief Davis waited in the medical facility's corridor throughout the entire procedure, refusing offers to rest or get his own minor injuries treated. Thompson and Rodriguez, both stable and recovering, had insisted on remaining at the hospital despite being cleared for transport to larger medical facilities. "You don't have to wait," the head nurse told Davis for the 3rd time. "We'll notify you when she's out of surgery." "Ma'am, that woman saved my life and the lives of my men," Davis replied. "I'm not going anywhere until I know she's okay." Word of the rescue had spread throughout the military network with unprecedented speed. By evening, Rachel's actions were being discussed in briefing rooms from Kabul to the Pentagon. A communications specialist who had been deemed too emotional for combat operations had accomplished what elite special operations units would have considered an ambitious mission. At 2100 hours, the surgeon finally emerged from the operating room. Davis immediately stood up, followed by Thompson and Rodriguez, who had been moved to wheelchairs but refused to leave the hospital. "How is she, Doc?" Davis asked. Dr. Sarah Kim pulled off her surgical cap, exhaustion evident in her face. She's stable. We removed bullet fragments from her shoulder and thigh, repaired internal damage from the side wound, and addressed the head injury. She lost a lot of blood, but she's young and strong. Will she make a full recovery? Thompson asked from his wheelchair. The shoulder wound will require extensive physical therapy, and she'll have some permanent scarring. But physically, yes, she should recover completely. Dr. Kim paused, studying the faces of the three SEALs. What I don't understand is how she remained functional with those injuries. Most people would have gone into shock and collapsed. Davis smiled for the first time in hours. Doc, you'd have to know her to understand. That woman doesn't quit when people are depending on her. When Rachel finally regained consciousness 18 hours later, the first thing she saw was Davis sitting beside her hospital bed, reading a paperback novel. Chief, she said weakly, her voice hoarse from the surgical intubation. How are Thompson and Rodriguez? Davis looked up from his book, amazed that her first conscious words were about the welfare of others. They're fine, Martinez. Thompson's going to make a full recovery, and Rodriguez is already talking about getting back to operations. Good, Rachel replied, closing her eyes briefly. That's good. Martinez, Davis said quietly, do you understand what you accomplished out there? Rachel considered the question, her mind still foggy from anesthesia and pain medication. I did. What anyone would have done in that situation. No, Davis corrected her firmly. You did what no one else could have done. You navigated hostile territory alone, coordinated complex fire missions under pressure, carried wounded men twice your size through enemy fire, and stayed conscious long enough to provide covering fire while bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Martinez, I've served with elite special operations units for 15 years. What you did out there was extraordinary by any standard. 3 months later, Rachel stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. Her left arm still in a brace, but her posture ramrod straight as the Secretary of Defense pinned a silver star to her uniform. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States." But for Rachel, the most meaningful moment came when Chief Davis, Thompson, and Rodriguez stood and saluted as her name was called. They had flown from their respective assignments to be there, understanding that her courage had given them the chance to see their families again. The girl they had called too emotional had proven that caring deeply about others wasn't a weakness. It was the ultimate source of strength. Her unauthorized rescue had changed military policy, opened combat roles previously closed to women, and redefined what it meant to be a warrior. As she walked out of the Pentagon that day, Rachel carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those who feel the least, but by those who feel the most and refuse to let that stop them from doing what's right. The 4 bullets that should have ended everything had instead marked the beginning of a legacy that would inspire soldiers for generations to come. Because in the end, it wasn't her size, her training, or her official qualifications that saved those SEALs. It was her heart. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.